Within hours of Elizabeth I drawing her final breath, her body was sealed inside a lead coffin and soldered shut. No public viewing, no slow embalming, no royal farewell. Historians pointed to that sealed coffin as proof she was hiding something. A male anatomy, a secret buried with her for 4 centuries. But what if the rush had nothing to do with what was under her skin, and everything to do with what was happening to it? This is not a cover-up. This is decomposition. March 24th, 1603, Richmond Palace, Surrey. And the most powerful woman in the Western world is dead on the floor. Not in her bed, on the floor. Elizabeth I had refused to lie down for 15 days straight. She sat on cushions, then on bare ground, then simply stopped moving altogether. When her body finally gave out, her attendants had to carry her to a mattress just so she could die on something softer than stone. What happened in the hours that followed broke almost every rule of Tudor royal tradition. When a monarch died in 16th century England, the process was methodical, ceremonial, and slow. The body would be eviscerated, the organs removed and separately preserved. The corpse would then be embalmed, packed with herbs, wrapped in cerecloth, treated with preserving agents, and laid in state for weeks, sometimes months, so that the court, the nobility, and eventually the public could pay their respects. It was not just tradition, it was political. A visible body was proof of a peaceful succession. It told the kingdom, the queen is gone. The transition is orderly, there is nothing to fear. None of that happened with Elizabeth. Within hours of her death, some accounts say as few as 4, her body was placed inside a lead-lined coffin and sealed. Not wrapped and displayed, not prepared for a lying in state, sealed. The lid was soldered shut. No one outside her immediate chamber attendants saw what was inside, and that decision has fueled speculation for 400 years. The most persistent theory, the one that still circulates in documentaries, forums, and history books, is that the rapid sealing was deliberate concealment. That Elizabeth I was in fact biologically male. That the rushed burial was engineered to protect a secret her court had spent decades carefully managing. It sounds extraordinary, but the people making this argument do have something to point to. The fact that no physician's report from her final days survives in complete form. The fact that access to her body was severely restricted. The fact that her own instructions reportedly included a request not to be subjected to a post-mortem examination. It looks on the surface like a cover-up. But here is what those theories consistently ignore: the biological reality of what was already happening inside that body before she even died. Because if you look at the medical record of Elizabeth I's final weeks, you are not looking at the profile of a healthy woman whose secret needed protecting. You are looking at something far more urgent, far more dangerous, and far more difficult to contain. The coffin wasn't sealed to hide what she was. It was sealed because of what her body had already become. Elizabeth I did not die suddenly. She died in stages, and her body was already breaking down long before her heart stopped. The winter of 1603 had been brutal on her. She was 69 years old, which in Tudor England was exceptional, but her body had accumulated decades of damage that most people never discuss. The white lead makeup she had worn daily since the 1560s, the famous pale mask called Venetian ceruse, contained significant concentrations of lead and mercury. Worn across the face, neck, and chest for 40 years, those compounds had been slowly absorbed through the skin, accumulating in her tissue, disrupting her nervous system, and weakening her immune response in ways her physicians had no framework to understand. By late February 1603, she had developed a severe throat infection. Her tonsils were visibly inflamed. She could barely swallow. And somewhere in those final weeks, that infection crossed a threshold. From localized to systemic, the bacteria entered her bloodstream. What followed was septicemia, blood poisoning, a full-body inflammatory response that her already compromised immune system could not contain. Her legs, already swollen with edema from what some historians believe was early heart failure, developed open ulcers that refused to heal. Tissue was dying at the surface while infection spread internally. She refused all treatment, refused to eat, refused to be moved to a bed. Her attendants described her as sitting motionless for hours, staring at nothing, occasionally pressing her finger to her cheek. A gesture some interpreted as melancholy, but which may have reflected the neurological effects of advanced lead toxicity. By the time Elizabeth I died, her body was not simply a corpse. It was already a vessel of active, aggressive bacterial activity. and that changes everything about what happened next. Now, before we go further into the science, there is something worth pausing on. The septicemia explains the urgency. The infections, the open ulcers, the compromised immune system, all of that builds a clear medical picture of why the burial happened so fast. But it does not explain the anomalies that existed long before March 1603. The skeletal irregularities noted in medical examinations decades earlier. The testimonies of chamber attendants describing details about Elizabeth's body that were quietly removed from official records. The portraits commissioned late in her reign that her own court tried to suppress. Those are a different conversation, and we built an entire archive around it. It is called Tudor ENIGMA, months of compiled primary sources, forensic analysis, and historical documents that rarely surface in mainstream discussions. Everything the biology cannot answer that archive attempts to address. The link is the first one in the description and in the pinned comment below. Take a look when this video is done, but right now, back to the body. Because what happened inside that coffin is something the history books have never fully explained. Most people assume decomposition begins days after death. In Elizabeth's case, it may have begun within hours. And the reason for that comes down to basic biology. When a body dies in a state of active septicemia, the bacteria already circulating in the bloodstream don't stop. They accelerate. With no immune system left to fight them, they begin consuming tissue from the inside out almost immediately. The process is called putrefaction. And in a body already saturated with infection, it moves at a pace that is genuinely shocking to witness. Or in the case of Elizabeth's attendants, to smell. There is another factor that almost no one mentions in the conspiracy discussions. The lead in mercury from 40 years of Venetian ceruse had almost certainly altered the microbial environment inside her body. Heavy metal accumulation disrupts gut flora, changes the bacterial populations living in tissue, and can create conditions where certain aggressive decomposition bacteria thrive far earlier than they would in a healthy corpse. Her body was not a normal post-mortem environment. It was a chemically compromised one, and that made it unstable in ways her physicians could not have predicted or explained. The gases produced by internal bacterial activity, hydrogen sulfide, methane, ammonia, build up rapidly in a sealed cavity. The abdomen distends, tissue liquefies, and the pressure continues to rise. This is not speculation. This is standard forensic pathology, and it is exactly what the historical record says happened. We don't have to speculate about what happened inside that lid coffin, because someone was there to witness it. Lady Elizabeth Southwell was one of Elizabeth I's ladies-in-waiting. She was present at Richmond Palace in the days following the Queen's death, and her account, preserved in a manuscript held at the Manuscript Collections of the British Library, describes something that no official royal record dared to put in writing. She wrote that the lead coffin cracked. The internal pressure from post-mortem gas buildup had become so extreme that the soldered seams physically split. The coffin, designed specifically to contain and preserve, had effectively detonated from the inside. Southwell described the event in terms that made clear this was not a minor structural failure. This was a biological emergency in the middle of a royal palace. The smell alone had already become a serious problem. Attendants reportedly could not remain in the room for extended periods. Members of the Privy Council, who would normally have been expected to pay formal respects near the body, were keeping their distance. The practical concern was real. If the coffin could not contain the gases during the lying-in state, it certainly could not survive a public funeral procession through the streets of London without becoming a catastrophic public health incident. This is the detail that the cover-up theories cannot account for. If the goal was simply to hide Elizabeth's anatomy, a sealed coffin would have been sufficient from the moment of death. There would have been no need to rush, no need for the visible panic among her council, no need for the extraordinary measures taken to limit access to the body even from senior members of her own court. The urgency was not political, it was biological. The body was decomposing faster than anyone had anticipated, and the people responsible for managing the transition of the English crown were simultaneously trying to manage a decomposition event that was threatening to become visibly, violently, and publicly uncontrollable. The coffin wasn't sealed to protect a secret, it was sealed to protect the living. 400 years of conspiracy, 400 years of whispers that Elizabeth I was hiding a male body inside a female disguise. And the answer was never in her chromosomes. It was in her cortisol, her infections, her lead-saturated tissue, her refusal to rest for 15 days while septicemia consumed her from the inside. The real story of Elizabeth's rapid burial is not a cover-up. It is something far more tragic than that. It is the story of a woman who had spent 44 years performing strength, refusing to show weakness, refusing to marry, refusing to be seen as vulnerable, and whose body ultimately paid the full price of that performance. The chronic stress, the toxic cosmetics, the infections left untreated out of stubbornness or fear, the years of sleep deprivation and political siege, all of it accumulated into a final collapse so severe that even her corpse could not hold itself together long enough for a proper royal farewell. The men who sealed that coffin were not protecting a secret identity. They were managing a biological crisis they had no scientific language to describe. They knew the body was dangerous. They knew the smell was spreading through the palace. They knew the coffin had already cracked under internal pressure. And they knew that the woman who had defined English power for nearly half a century could not be allowed to decompose publicly in the middle of her own funeral procession. Sealing that coffin was the last act of dignity they could offer her. Not a cover-up, a mercy. The conspiracy is a more exciting story, but the biology is a more honest one. And sometimes the truth is not hidden in a secret. It is hidden in plain sight, inside a cracked lead coffin in a palace in Surrey, leaking through the seams. If you found this investigation valuable, subscribe and leave a comment below with what you want us to examine next. Every source referenced in this video is linked in the description. The history is real, the science is documented, and there is far more where this came from.